So from today, we are going to see object-oriented programming concepts in Python. So basically, if I take any programming languages, so some programming language will belong to either structured programming language or object-based programming language or object-oriented programming language. So if I take any language, for example, if I take C language, so C is a structured programming language and it doesn't have any object-oriented programming concept. It doesn't support any object-oriented programming features. Now, if I just go to C++ language, which is object-oriented programming language, which will support object-oriented programming concepts. And if I go with the Java, so Java is also support object-oriented programming concepts. So which is also purely Java object-oriented programming language. And if I just see Visual Basic, and that's also a programming language, but it doesn't support complete object-oriented programming concept, but it is just support only class and object concept. And that is comes under object-based programming language. But when you come to the Python, so Python will support structure and as well as object-oriented. Python will support structure programming language plus object-oriented programming language. Object-oriented programming language. Now, let us compare this Python with Java. So why Java is purely object-oriented programming? Because in Java, we cannot write a single program without creating a class. So in object-oriented programming, the main entity is a class. Class is the first concept which we have to discuss as part of object-oriented programming concept. Class and object. So without using class in Java, we cannot write single line of code. So we have to create a class and object, then we will proceed further. So that's the reason Java is a purely object-oriented programming concept. But when you come to the Python, so far we have not created any classes and objects, but still we are able to write the Python code and still we are able to execute our program. So what does that mean is, which is supporting structured programming language, is supporting structure-oriented programming language. So without creating any classes and object also, we can write our code in Python and we can execute our code. So that's the main feature of Python, which is supported both structure-oriented as well as object-oriented. So far, we have not used any classes and objects in our previous sessions, but still we are able to create our programs and still we are able to execute our programs because the Python is supported structure-oriented programming language. But when we can say a language is object-oriented programming language. So if I want to say any language is object-oriented programming language, which should support certain number of object-oriented programming features, which we can call them as a OOPS concepts. Object-oriented programming system. So object-oriented programming concept, it should support object-oriented programming concepts. Okay, so if I take any programming language which will support object-oriented programming concept, then we can call them as a object-oriented programming languages. But what are those object-oriented programming concept? The first one is a class. Second one is an object. And then inheritance. And then loading. We can also call it as a polymorphism. So polymorphism is basically we can implement by using overloading concept. So polymorphism. Okay, so these are the main concepts which are there in object-oriented programming concept. And if any programming language is supporting these features, which we can call them as a object-oriented programming concepts. Okay, object-oriented programming language. Now, as part of today's session, we are going to see about class and object. So these are first concepts which we have to understand before understanding the rest of the concepts. So class and object. What is class? What is object? How to create a class? How to create an object? And what is the main usage of classes and object? So these things we will discuss as part of today's session. Okay. So let us start. What is a class? Simply, it can understand in general terminology. So then we will talk about technical terms. Class and object. So don't think about programming language. In general language, whenever I say class, what is the meaning of class? So class is nothing but a category. Suppose in a class, there are number of students are there. So all together we can call it as a one class. And similarly, suppose there are so many animals are there. So all the animals are comes under one class, animal class. Right? Suppose there are so many people are working on some organization. So all people where comes under employees. So employee is a class. Right? So these are all real-time classes. But what about the object means? So object is a physical entity. For example, when I say employee, an employee is a class, but whoever is working on the organization, they are all comes under the objects. So for example, John is an employee, Scott is an employee, Mary is an employee. So these people are employees only, but these are the physical objects, and this is a class. Logical object, logical entity, we can simply say is a logical entity, whereas objects are physical entities. And similarly, animal is a class. Animal is a class, but what are all animals are there? Like say dog, horse, right, elephant. So all these are objects. These are all objects which are belongs to one single class. Similarly, birds is a class, and human being is a class, right? So this is simple, a basic difference. So class and object. So class is basically a physical entity, whereas objects are class is a logical entity, whereas objects are physical entity. Now come to the technical part. What is exactly class means technically? So class is a collection of variables and methods. That is the actual definition of the class in technical perspective. Class is a collection of variables and methods. So if I just look at the employee, so every employee is having some name. Every employee is having some ID. Every employee will get some salary, right? But the values of those are different. But every employee is having ID. IDs can be different. ID values can be different, but every employee must have some ID. Every employee name can be different, but every employee should have some name. Every employee salary will be different, but every employee will get some salary. Similarly, every animal, the physical structure will be different, color may be different, behavior will be different, but every animal is having certain number of color, behavior, and everything. Similarly, a class is a collection of variables, means what? Attributes. Attributes means, for example, let us take an employee. Every employee is having name, ID, salary. So they are called as attributes. We can consider them as a variables. And similarly, every employee is getting some bonus. And we need to calculate the bonus of every employee. So for that, we need to create some logic. And that logic we will create in the methods, which is called as a behavior. Suppose every animal is eat differently, drink differently, but anyway, they will eat it and they will drink it. Every animal will eat, every animal will drink, but they eat some different food and they drink the different thing. So that is basically comes under the behavior. So in the technical point of view, the class is nothing but a collection of variables and methods. What class contains? Class contains the variables and methods. So this is a technical definition. And a class is a blueprint. Simply a class is a blueprint. A class is a blueprint. What is a blueprint means? So blueprint is nothing but again logical entity. So for example, let us say before constructing the building, so we will have some plan, right? So let's say this is my plan. So according to this plan, we will construct multiple buildings, right? So these buildings are objects following the same plan. But what about this plan? This is just a blueprint, but this is not a real object. This is just a blueprint. Based on that, we can construct multiple buildings with the same plan. Similarly, a class is a blueprint, just a blueprint. It is a logical entity. That's the reason it doesn't occupy any space in the memory. So when you create a class, it doesn't occupy any space in the memory, because this is just a logical entity which contains the multiple variables and multiple methods we can create. But what is the use of this class? So once you create a class, we can create multiple objects. Once you create a class, we can create multiple objects. Let me just take one example. So let us say I have one class. Let's name it as a employee class. The name of the class is employee. So every employee is having some data, right? So let me just add some data here. So here, every employee is having employee ID. Every employee is having employee name. Every employee is having some designation or some job name, or every employee will get the salary, and also every employee will get some bonus. So bonus we need to calculate based on the formula, right? So we will have some function. Let's say this is my function. This is my function which is created. Now this is a employee class. Now when I create a class like this, there is no use because which contains just a variable and method implementation, but we need to create an object. So how to create an object? If we have one class, for that class, we can create n number of objects. For example, this is one object and this is another object. And like this, we can create multiple number of objects for the same class. We can create multiple objects for the same class. Now, as soon as you created an object, then what happens is the object will acquire everything from the class. So these are objects. Let's say this is emp1 object, and this is emp2 object, and this is emp3 object. So as soon as you created an object for this class, now object is a physical entity which will occupy certain amount of space in the memory. It is a physical entity. But what is the object contains? Whatever the variables and methods we created in the class, the same thing will be there in the object also. The same thing will be there in the object also. That means what? Every object will acquire their own copy of the variables and methods. Every object will acquire their own copy of the variables and methods. So now the class is a logical entity, whereas object is a physical entity. The first point. Second point, a class is just a blueprint, but actual objects are these. These are the actual objects. And the class will not occupy any space in the memory, whereas object is a physical, so that it will occupy certain amount of space in the memory. So for one class, we can create any number of objects, and every object is independent. So there is no relation between these objects. Why? Because they are independent. emp1 is different, emp2 is different, emp3 is different. And even though every object is getting the same variables and same methods, the values will be different. emp1 id will be different, emp2 id will be different, emp3 id will be different. Similarly, emp1 name is different, emp2 name is different, emp3 name is different. And when you calculate the bonus of the employee 1 bonus will be different, employee 2 bonus will be different, emp3 bonus will be different. That means what? Every object is independent. There is no connection between the objects, even though they have derived from the same class. Okay, so these are the basic fundamental points which we need to remember before working with the classes and object. Okay, so let me just write a few important points. So class is a collection of variables and methods, and a class is a blueprint, is a logical entity, doesn't occupy space in the memory. But what is an object? So what is an object? We can simply say object is an instance of a class, an instance of a class, and we are giving the physical form of the class. So object is an instance of the class, and which is physical entity, and it will occupy certain amount of space in the memory. Okay, so these are the few important points which we need to understand before about class and the object. So now, as soon as you created a class, we can create multiple objects, and these objects are independent. So for one class, we can create multiple objects, but objects are independent. Objects are independent. Okay, so with this understanding, so we will see practically how we can create a class, then how we can create an objects. So how objects will acquire all the variables and methods individually, and how we can access this variable and method. So these things we will see practically. Okay. So here I'm using two things. So one is a method I'm talking about. Method. So class is a collection of variables and methods. I'm saying, what does this method means? So method is exactly the same as a function. In the previous session, we have discussed about the function, right? By using def keyword, we have created a function. But there is a difference here between the function and the method. So what is the difference between function and method? If I create a same function within the class, we can call it as a method. Simple difference. Okay. So without creation of the class, if I created just a function, we can call it as a general function. Right. So yesterday we have seen, we have not used so far any classes, but still we are able to create multiple functions. They are all called functions. But the same function, if I write inside the class, which we can call it as a method. Simple difference between function and method. We can create without a class, and method creates inside the class. But same thing, how we have created the function, in the similar way we have to create a method. But if you create a function without the class, we can call it as a function. If I create the same function within the class, we can call it as a method. So just remember the difference between function and method. Entry question, especially in Python, there is a difference in function and method. Okay. Now with this understanding, so let's move and see practical examples of class and objects. So go back to the PyCharm. Very important. Listen carefully. So I'm just creating a new directory. I say day 7. So inside this, I'm just creating one example. Let me just take Python file. I'll name it as oops.py. Object-oriented programming concepts. So I'm just going to show you all of them in this one single file. So oops.py created. Now let us see example 1. The first example. Example 1. How to create a class, how to create an object. First thing. So in Python, if you want to create a class, we use a keyword called a class. Okay, keyword is a class, and space, give the name of the class. Let's say I say something called my class. This is the name of the class, and then colon, and inside the class we can write variables and methods. So for example, I'm writing simple a method, and variables or methods are optional. Sometimes you may have only variables, sometimes you may have only methods, sometimes you may have variables and methods. I'm just showing you simple method how we can create. Def my function. Okay, so inside this, I'm not implementing anything. I'm just writing empty function. But you should not leave the function like this. We have to give some keyword called pass. So what does that mean? Whenever you create a function inside the class, we can call it as a method. And by default, every method will take one argument called as a self. Okay, default argument is self. And if this function is taking multiple parameters, you have to specify those parameters by specifying the comma. But we should not remove the self. So whenever you say self, that is basically representing a class name. Okay, so this function belongs to this class. That's the meaning of self. What is the meaning of self? So whenever I say self here, this particular method belongs to this particular class. That's the meaning of self. So whenever you create a function inside the class, that should have self keyword by default. Okay. And what is the pass means? I'm not trying to implement this function. This is an empty function. So that's the reason I can simply say pass. Pass is nothing but none. Now I'll create one more function. I'll say def. And here we should not say function. Okay. Because we are writing the function inside the class, so that we can call them as a methods, not a functions. Okay. Now def display, I'm creating one more method. Inside this, I'm just saying print name. What is this name? I'll tell you. So I'm just printing the name. This is the two methods I have created. So here simply a function, and here I'm just specifying something, or we can simply say John. Okay, so some value I'm printing here. So this is a declaration of the class. This syntax which you have to follow while creating the class. So this is a one method, and this is another method. Indentation is most important, guys. If I don't put this indentation, that will give an error. So give one tab space, that will automatically add indentation. But in PyCharm, you don't find that kind of problem, because as soon as you say enter, automatically the indentation will be automatically added. So this is one function, this is one method, and this is another method which we created inside the class. Two methods we have created. But how to create an object of the class? So how to create an object of the class? So to create the object of the class, just come out from the class and specify the class name. What is the class name here? My class. I say my class. Same thing you have to say, my class, and then open the brackets. So this is the actual object. So as soon as you say like this is an object. Simple, this is an object. And if you want to store this object in a variable, you can just say some variable name you can create. Again, that is an optional. If you want to store, this is the object actually. So this object, if you want to store in a variable, this is a variable. And this variable is referring to the object. And similarly, I can create any number of variables. MC1 and this MC2. Again, this is another object. My class. This is another object. So MC1 is referring to one object. MC2 is another object referring to another object. So how it is going to create internally? Internally, it is creating like this. So this is a my class. So this is a my class name. This is actually class. For this class, we created two objects. So one is MC1, other one is MC2. So which will occupy their own memory, and here it will occupy their own memory. So what are the two methods we created? These two methods are belongs to here and here. So these two objects will acquire their own copy of the methods from this class. Okay. Now, if this method, if this object contains two functions or two methods, my function, display, then how we can access this object data, or how we can access this object methods? To access this object methods, what you have to do is we have to call those functions, or we have to call those methods through the object variable. Through the object variable. Now you can just say, taking one object MC1, MC1 dot my function. So this is how we need to call it. So you can consider this MC1 itself is an object, no problem, nothing wrong in that. But actually this is an object that is referred by this MC1. Now MC1 dot my function means what? We are calling this my function from the MC1 object. And what else we have? Display also there. So I can just say MC1 dot display. MC1 dot display. So by using this object, I am calling the first method and also I'm calling the second method. Now when I execute this, so this will give you an output. You can see the first method is nothing. I'm not written any body in this, so it is not given any output. First method. But when you come to the second method, it is just printing some value here. So this is printed some value like this. So this is a simple example how we can create a class, how we can create an object, through object how we can access the methods. So the same thing we have to follow throughout classes and objects concept. Okay. So this is how we need to say. So for example, and I want to pass this name as an argument into this method. I want to pass this name as an argument. So then we have to pass name, and this name I will print it here. That name I will print it here. So now what happened when you call the display function or display method, we have to pass the argument. So it is expecting one argument called a name. But what is the self here? Self is representing the class actually. Okay, that should be there. We should not remove the self. But if I want to pass one argument or parameter to this method, we have to specify that parameter separately by using comma. Now, when I call this display method through object, it is expecting some parameters. So we have to pass that parameter here. I'm passing, let's say Scott. So then execute, then observe this. It is printed Scott. Why? Because we are passing this parameter. Name is storing that value, and here it is printing. So when I'm showing something here means what? These are all again belongs to this MC1 object. So that's the reason we're able to call this method from the MC1 object. That's the reality. But at the time of showing, I'm just showing you here. Actually, these two methods are belongs to object. That's the reason we are able to call those methods through the object. Okay, simple example. How to create a class, how to create an object, how to call the method from that object. So let me show you a few more examples, then you will be more clear about this. Comment this. Then go to another example. Example 2. Now see this example. It's very, very simple. I create one class. And so before going to that next level, are you guys clear on this first one? So what is the class, how to define the class, and how to create an object, how to call the methods? Are you guys clear on this example? Please confirm in the chat window. Okay, so these are the just functions. Yesterday we have seen different type of functions. If I create the same functions within the class, we can call them as a methods. But because a class is a logical entity, we have to create an object, and object will acquire everything from the class. So object name dot method name we have to call. Now let me show you one more example. I'm creating one more class called, I'll say my class. Inside this, I'm creating one method. I said def m1 and self. I'm not passing anything inside this method. I just print something called instance method. Actually, in the class, we can create two types of methods. In the class, we can create two types of methods. What are those two types? We can define within the class. Two types of methods we can define within the class. So one type is instance method. We can call it as an instance method. And the second one is a static method. Instance method, static method. So what is instance method? These methods we can call only through object. Okay, so instance methods we can call only through object, just like this. In the previous example, we created a class, we created an object. So through that object, we are able to call the methods. So these are all instance methods. Instance means what? Object. Instant is nothing but an object, simple. So we are able to call those methods through object. That is the first type of method, instance method. Second type of method is a static method. And these methods we can directly call by using a class. So static methods we can directly call using the class name itself. So we no need to create any object for that. Okay, we no need to create an object for those methods. So how to create a static method, that I will show you. So there are two kinds of methods we can create in the class. One is instance method, the other one is a static method. Now I created one method here. What type of method it is? Instance method or static method? So by default it is a instance method, right? This is a instance method. So I'm just writing simple message. I say this is instance method. This is instance method. But how to create a static method? So I create one more method, def m2. Let me pass one parameter also. Let's say number. And inside this, I'm writing something. I just want to print the number. So now I want to make this method as a static method. So by default, it is also an instance method. But how we can make that method as static method? If I make this method as a static method, what is an advantage? So we can access that method using class name itself. And one more usage is this method is common for every object. This method is a common for every object. So that's the meaning of static here. So if we want to make this method as a static, we have to specify something called annotation @static method. So when you specify this kind of annotation, this is called as an annotation. Okay, you have to remember some technical terms, guys. So I'm using them, annotation. So @static method. This is called as an annotation. So whichever method we specified with the static method annotation, that method will be treated as a static method. That method is treated as a static method. So what is an advantage of it? So when you create a static method, that method is a common for every object. What does that mean again? What does a common means? Let me just give you one example. I have one class here. Okay, let me just clear this. So let us say I have a simple class. Okay, so inside the class, I have one method called m1, and which is having some implementation also. And for this class, I created one object and another object I created. So two objects I have. And in the first object, the same m1 method will be there. In the second object also acquired the same m1 method. Okay, now two objects are having M1 method. But if you want to make this method, implementation will be different, because let us say this is my bonus method, calculating the bonus of the employee. So here I'll implement this method differently in object 1 and implement the same method differently in object 2. But I don't want to implement this method separately. I want to have the same kind of implementation for all the methods, all the objects. In that case, I can make this as a common method. For that, we can specify as a static method. So static methods are common methods across multiple objects. And this static method is actually belongs to class only. But as soon as you created an object, this is also belongs to object. So if you want to access this method, you can directly access through the class. Through object also we can access, but it is not necessary here. We can access this method through the directly using class. Okay, so now if I just go back again, I created one instance method and this is a static method. And what is the difference between instance method and static method? Instance method we can invoke through object only, whereas static method we can invoke directly by using a class itself. That's the difference. Now let me try to invoke them. So first let us try to invoke the instance method. How to invoke the instance method here? First we need to create an object of the my class. How to create an object of the my class? I say my class. This is an object. And if I want to store this object, I can create one variable. I say MC. And here MC dot, you can see M1, M2. So both you will able to access. M1 method I'm accessing. And MC dot M2. Can we access M2 here? Yes, M2 also will able to access, but we need to pass one parameter. I'm passing 100. Now execute and see how it will work. What is giving? It is giving one required positional parameter num. It is required to pass one positional parameter num. So here the static method M2, we just passed only one argument. But as soon as you say static method, right, self is also expect one argument. So here one argument is not enough. Okay, so here we are trying to call the static method through object actually. So this doesn't make any sense, first of all, because static method we should be able to access only through the class. That's the first thing. But still, even though we are able to access the static method through the object, here we are passing just one argument. But when you make this method as a static method, we have to pass one more argument for self also. The reason is the self keyword of instance method, the self keyword or of static method will be different, because the self keyword in the instance method is referring to the class. But here the self keyword within the static method is referring as a parameter, is a not belongs to any class. So it is also expecting one parameter. So we have to pass two arguments here. So now 100 will be stored in the self, 200 will be stored in the number, and here we can print self and number both. So I can just print self here, comma, number. So when you try to execute, now we'll get the 100 and 200. Now let me repeat this. A small confusion is there, don't worry. So whenever you create a static method, self also consider as a one parameter. But when you create an instance method, self is not considered as a parameter. This is actually representing the class. That's the reason the color of the variable also different here and here. Okay, so this is the first thing. But one more thing is we should not call the static method using object. That's not a standard process, because static methods we can directly invoke by the class name itself. But how to invoke the static method by using class name? Directly use class name my class dot M2. And here you can just directly pass the two variables. I can pass 100 and I can pass 10 and I can pass 20. So it is directly possible. So I'm getting 10 and 20. So this is how we can just invoke the instance method and the static method. Instance method and the static method. And here we are calling the static method directly using the class. not through object. Here we are not created any object. This is a class name. And through the class name, we are able to call the static method. Okay, so this is a one more example related to static method and instant method. So we have discussed two parts, instant method and static method. Instant method we can access through object. Static methods we can access through class. Now, let me show you one more example. Listen first carefully. If you have any queries, I will discuss that. Okay. Example 3. So here I want to declare the variables also. For example, in the previous sessions, we have discussed two kinds of variables. What are they? Anyone is remembered? So what are the two types of variables we discussed in the previous session? I think yesterday's session only I have discussed. There are two kinds of variables we can define. What are those two types? Have anyone remember? What are the two types of variables we can define? Global and local variable. Very good. And what is a local variable and what is a global variable? The local variables are the variables which we can create and access only within the function. And global variables are the variables which we can create outside of the function and we can access them everywhere. That's what we have seen, right? And now today, there are one more type of variable will be added, class variables. So now we will discuss them. Class variables. Global variables, we already know that. Local variables also we will know. And when I create a variables within the method, we can call them as a local variable. And what about the class variables? Class variables. Okay, class variables. So first global variables and actually followed by class variables and then local variables. So now three different type of variables, global variables, class variables, and local variables. Because today we have introduced the class. In the previous sessions, we don't have a class. So we have just defined the global variables and local variables. We were working with them. But now I'm introducing you class variables. And now we'll see how we can do that. So here I'm just creating my class. I'll say class, my class. Class name is my class. You can give anything. This is the name of the class. Inside this class, I just want to create a variables because what is the definition of the class? Class contains the variables and methods, right? As per the definition of the class contains the variables and methods. I've just seen how to create a method. We can also create a variables. So in this class, I'm creating two variables. I say a comma b equal to 10 comma 20. So a value is a 10, b value is 20. So we can create like this, right? In Python, it is possible. A comma b equal to 10 comma 20. So a value is 10, b value is equal to 20. And what type of these variables they are? They are class variables. Because these variables are created inside the class. So these are called as a class variables. Now I'm creating one method. Inside the class itself, I'm creating one method. Def add self. I'm not passing any arguments inside this. And I'm just trying to print a and b value. Can we directly access a comma b here? It is given error. Can we access a comma b inside the method? We cannot, because these are all not global variables. If they are global variables, we can access them inside this method. But now these variables are class variables. We cannot directly access them inside the method. So to access this class variable inside this method, we have to use self keyword. I say self dot a comma self dot b. So as I already told you, what is self means? Self is representing the class always. Whenever you see self keyword, that is always representing the class, right? So here, if I want to access the class variables inside this method, we have to define the self keyword, self dot a, self dot b. I'm printing those values separately. So if I want to access the class variables inside the method, we have to use a self keyword. This is a thumb rule you have to remember. Okay. Now, so I have created one method here. Similarly, let me create one more method. So def And here I'll say multiplication. And here also I'm not taking any argument, but I want to multiply these two values. So here I will try to add those values, addition of two numbers. And here I want to multiply those two values. So two different methods I have created inside the class. And here I'm talking about only class variables. Okay, we will see combinations of local variable, global variable, everything. So for now, I'm just focusing on class variables. Now let us create an object of my class. My class, MC is my object. Now MC dot, how to call the method? So just say add. And do we need to pass any argument here? Nothing. And similarly, I say MC dot multiplication. Now execute. So this will give you result 30. So addition of two numbers, which will return 30, and multiplication of two numbers, it will return 200. So what exactly we have done here is we created a class variables, and how to access those class variables inside the method by using self keyword only. Why? Because self is a keyword which is always representing the class. That's the reason self.a means what? Class variable I'm trying to access. Self.b means what? Class variable I'm able to access. Okay, so this is one example, how to create a class variables and how to access those class variables inside these methods. Okay, now I'll show you combination of local variable, class variable, and global variable. One more example. Example 4. So global variable, class variable, and local variable. This time I will define all of them. So first let us create a global variable. I say I comma j equal to 15 comma 25. So here I have not created any method. I have not created any function or any class, nothing. So these are all global variables. These two are the global variables. Global variables. Now I'll create one class here. Listen this carefully, very important. Class, and I'll say my class. My class. So inside the class, I will also define two more variables. I can say a comma b equal to 10 comma 20. So these are all class variables. These are all class variables. Now I'll create one method. Let's say def. Okay, def add. And here along with the self keyword, I'm expecting two arguments. I say x comma y. Two arguments I'm expecting. And observe this carefully. So x comma y are the local variables here. And local variables in the sense, not only the parameters, even if you create these variables inside the method, also local variables. Okay, because these x and y we can access only within this method, right? They are local variables. So here x comma y are local variables. Now observe this carefully. This is most important step. We have a class variables. We have a global variables. We have a class variables. We have a local variables. Now inside this method, I want to access all kinds of variables. So can we directly access this or not? X and Y we can directly access. Simply what you can do, print x plus y. So what is this x and y? Local variable. So we can directly access. Perfectly fine. So here x comma y are local variables. So I can just write this statement here. X, y are the local variables. We are able to directly access them within the method. But I want to perform addition of these two values, A and B. They are class variables. They are class variables. How to access? Now tell me how to access. I want to access A and B. I want to perform sum of A plus B. How to access here? In the previous example, I told you. So how to access the class variable inside this method? By using self keyword. So self is always representing the class. You should not forget that. Okay. So if you want to access the class variables, we have to use self keyword. Very good. Self.a plus self.b. Perfectly fine. So here A comma B are class variables. Class variables. Now I want to access global variables. I want to perform sum of these two values. How to access the global variables? So we can directly access global variables everywhere. There is no restriction for global variables. So we can directly say print I plus j. So here we are able to access I comma j are global variables. So now you understood the difference between global variables, class variables, and local variables. So the local variables are the local, which we can access only within the method. Class variables are belongs to the class, which we can access by using self keyword. And global variables we can access everywhere within the class, within the method, outside of the class also. If you want to print these values, you can write one more print statement here. You can print those values. So global variables we can access everywhere. Okay. Now, so we have created something like this. Now, if I want to access this method, how we can access? Through the object of the class. Now let me create one object MC equal to my class, and object is created. Now MC dot add. So this will this is expecting two argument x comma y, right? So I'm just passing some values. So 15, 25 already there, 10, 20 is also there. So I'm just giving two different values. Let's say 100 and comma 200. Right? So what is an output you will get? So when I call this add method by passing 100 to 100, 100 will be assigned to the x, 200 will be assigned to the y. So first it will print 100 plus 200, and then it will print sum of 10 plus 20. Then it will print sum of 15 plus 25. So there's a final output you will get. See, 300, 30, 14. So, but here we are just passing 100 and 200. With these values will apply only the local variables, but rest of the two statements also will be printed because we have used them inside the method. So this is how we can just work with the global variables, class variables, and local variables. Now understand this. I'll show you one more example. Just a second. Comment this. Now I'm copying the same thing. Let me just make it as a, sorry. Okay, just a second. Copy the same example. Comment this and copy the same example. This is example 5. Example 5. Okay, so now look at this. Here we have completed example 4. And are you guys clear with example 4? How to work with the global variables, accessing class variables and local variables. Okay, so now I'm just discussing one more example with the same concept, like global variables, class variables, and local variables. Okay, now let us start with that. Okay, so if I just look at this another example, let us say example 5. So in this, I'm just trying to use A comma B as a global variables. Now A, B are the global variables. And I will also specify the class variables are A comma B. The same names I'm using as a class variable names. And also local variables also I'm using the same variables, A comma B. So observe this carefully. So I'm just removing this stuff. So the global variable names are A comma B. Let me start recording. Yeah, it is recorded. So the global variable values are A comma B, and the class variable values also A comma B, and the local variable names also A comma B. Now I want to access global variables, class variables, local variables separately. So how we can access? Because in the previous examples, the variables names are different. IJ is different, AB is different, XY is different, but I'm using the same variable names as global variables, same variable names as a class variable, same variable names as a local variables. Now, how we can access them? So first thing, I want to access my local variables, A comma B. How we can access? Directly we can access, right? A comma B, I say A plus B. So in the local variables, we don't have any problem. I can simply say local. These are the local variables we can directly access. As soon as I say A comma B, by default, it will take the local variables. Now, how to access the class variables? The class variable names also A comma B. So here, simply we can say again self dot A plus self dot b. Now, what is the difference between these two here? When I say simple a, b, so which is treating as a local variable, which is considering as a local variables. So when I say self dot a, self dot b means they're considering them as a class variables. Now, I want to access the global variables. So just like in the previous way, if I just say print a comma b or a plus b, will it work or not? So this will consider as a local variables, just like this. These two statements are exactly the same. But in the previous example, the case is different. Okay, in the previous examples, xy is a local variables and ij are the global variables. So we are able to access I comma j directly here. But this time, AB are the global variables and here AB is also local variables. When I say A plus B directly, which will be considered as a local variable. But how we can access the global variables? If the variable names are same. So to access the global variables, we cannot directly access here. So we have to follow a different syntax. What is the different syntax? We have to use one internal function called globals. Globals of, inside the square bracket, we have to specify that variable name like this. And this will able to access the global variable value, which is A. Plus, I want to access this B also, global variable B also. For that, I can say one more function, globals, bracket. Inside this, I can say B. Okay. Now you can just look at this. This will access a global variable and this will access the global variable A and B. But in the previous example, we don't have such problem because the variable names are different. So this is a different, this one is different. But in this example, the variable names are exactly the same everywhere. So to access the local variable, we can directly access. To access the class variable, we can say self.a plus self.b. To access the global variables, we have to add one additional function called the globals. Globals of A plus globals of B. We are performing addition of these two numbers, so I'm just using plus operator here. So this will able to access global variables. And this will able to access class variables. And these are the local variables. Okay. So if the class variables, global variables, local variables are same, then this is the way we need to access. Now we can just create an object of MC and just pass some values 100, 200. So when you run this, you will get the same output. So first method is printed 300 because we pass 100 and 200. Second method is printed 30 because 10 plus 20 is 30. Third method is printed 40. So 15 plus 25, which is 40. So this is how we can work with the global variables, class variables, and local variables. Okay. And as I told you one point beginning, so we can create multiple objects for one single class, right? So that I will show you in one example. How to create multiple objects for one single class. Example 6. So here one class can have multiple objects. One class can have multiple objects. So how we can create multiple objects for one single class? So let's create one class, my class. And this is my class. Inside this, I'm just creating one method, def display. And I'm not passing any argument, so self. Inside this, I'm just printing some message. Print, this is display method, and just written some message. Now for this class, we can create n number of objects. So how to create an object? I say my class, and I say obj1, the first object. And then by using this object, I can call display method. Similarly, I can create one more object, obj2 equal to my class. And by using this obj2, we can call display method. Okay, so let us say this method is taking one argument also. Let us say some name. And apart from this print statement, I will also print the name here. I'll also print the name value. So as soon as you call the display method, I'll pass some name also because display method is expecting some name. So here I'm passing John in the first object. Now in the second object, I will pass Scott. Now I created two different objects. In the first object, I'm passing one name. In the second object, I'm passing another name. Let's execute. Now you can see these are the values which are coming from object 1, and these are the two values are coming from object 2, because we have called the display method by using two different objects. So like this, we can also create multiple objects for one single class. Okay, for one single class, we can create a multiple objects. This is one example. Now, let us see one more example. This is example 6. Example 7. So here we have one more concept called constructor. So we have something called as a constructor. So what is a constructor means? If I just look at the class, in this class, whenever you call this method through object, then only this method will be invoking, right? So through object, I just call this method explicitly, and then only this method is executing. But I want to execute something without calling the method. So I will just create a method like this inside the class, but that method I just directly execute without calling it, and which is basically called as a constructor. So here we need to understand the difference between method and a constructor. Method and a constructor. So what is a method means? Method, a constructor. At the definition wise, exactly the same. So method means we can give any name. So the method means we can give any name, and method can return the values, value or values, anything. And method can take the arguments also, or parameters. But how to call the method? Call the method, or we can just use, we have to use an object to invoke the method. So these are the points we already seen. So we can give any name to the method, and sometimes method can also return the value. The method can take arguments or parameters, and we have to use the object to invoke the methods, like object name dot method name. But what is the constructor means here? Constructor name should be underscore init__. We should not give whatever name you want. So this is a constructor name. By default, Python is having this constructor. So __init__self. So this is a constructor. So we should not give any name to the constructor. So the constructor name is fixed. So this is the name of the constructor. And method will return the value, but this constructor will never return the value. Constructor will not return any value. And even constructor also, we will use a def keyword. Okay, just like a method. So constructor will not return any value. And method can take arguments and parameters. Similarly, constructor also can take arguments or parameters. Constructor can also take arguments or parameters. And we have to use an object to invoke the method. But here we no need to use any object. But at the time of object creation itself, the constructor automatically invoked. At the time of object creation itself, constructor automatically invoked. We no need to call the constructor explicitly. So constructor will be called at the time of object creation itself. Okay, so this is a few important points which we need to remember. So if it is a method, we can give any name. But when you create a constructor, we have to give the same. We have to give this name __init__self. And method will return the value, but constructor will never return the value. Method can take the arguments or parameters, but constructor also will take the arguments. And method we have to invoke only through object, but constructor will automatically invoke at the time of object creation. So these are the few differences between method and constructor. Now I'll show you one example how to use a constructor. So constructor example. So let's create a class. So class contains the methods along with the constructors. Okay. So let me just create one class, my class. So inside this class, instead of creating a method, I'm just creating a constructor. How to create a constructor? I said def underscore init, and it will automatically popping up. So init, inside this, I'm just printing something. I say this is constructor, and just printing one message. Okay, along with the constructor, I can also write a multiple methods. So let me write one more method. I said def m1, and it is not taking any arguments. And here I'm just say print hello. Okay, so now I have created one constructor, one method inside the class. Now, if you want to invoke this constructor, we no need to create an object. We need to create an object, but at the time of creation of object itself, this constructor will automatically execute it. But if you want to call this method, we have to call this method only through object. Only through object we can call the function. Okay. So now let me just understand. So let me just create an object. How to create an object? Like this. MC equal to. I'm not calling anything, just I created an object. Let's execute and see what will happen. So this is a constructor. So this message is printed by constructor. What does it mean? As soon as you created an object, the constructor is automatically executed. So this statement, invoke constructor automatically. Okay, so this particular statement itself, the object itself, at the time of creation of object itself, constructor will automatically invoked. Okay, but function, a method is not like that. We have to call this method through the object. So if you want to invoke the method mc.m1, we have to call that method. So this is a method. So method we have to call explicitly by using object. So when you run this, you will get this output. So that's the basic difference between constructor and method. Constructor and method. And the constructor will never return any value, whereas method can return some value. It will perform some operation and can return some value. Okay, so for example, let me create one more method here. I say def m2, and it is taking two arguments. I say x comma y, and here it will print x plus y. So this is another method which is created, right? This is another method which is created. So instead of printing, I'm just return this value. Now how to invoke this m2? So I can say mc.m2, because m2 is expecting two arguments. So sorry guys. Okay, so now here we have just created one class, and which contains one constructor and two normal methods, right? So constructor will automatically invoke at the time of object creation, whereas the methods we have to call through the object. So here m2 is expecting two arguments, so we have to pass the two arguments. I'll say 10, 20. So now when I execute this, this will give you output. So here basically it is returning the value, but we are not printing the output anywhere else. See this m2 method, we are passing the two arguments into x and y, but it is just returning the output, but we are not printing anywhere. So the output we have to receive in some variable like this. So whenever a method is returning the value, we have to store that result in some variable, and then here we have to print it. Or else if you don't want to use any variable, you can directly put this statement directly inside the print function. So we can avoid another variable, because this method is returning value. That's the reason. So now this will print 30. So that's how we can create a constructor along with the methods. Okay. Now let me show you one more example. So we have seen how to declare the constructor inside the class and how to invoke the constructor. at the time of object creation. Okay, so let me just show you something. Okay, so guys, there is some problem actually. So I'll stop a session today. So practice whatever concept we have seen today's session, and tomorrow I will continue. Okay. Because again, maybe it will disconnect once again. Even recording is also having some problem. So I need to again check it. Yeah, guys. So if you have any questions, yeah, you can ask me now. I'm just stopping here.